Darkly Splendid Abodes, the official podcast of Toronto Thelema, exploring, if you will, practical philosophy, from science and the workings of the mind to spirituality, esotericism, and magic. Stooping down, dipping my wings, I came into the darkly splendid abodes. In December of 2024, Era Vulgaris, I gave the first of a series of talks on the Thelemic philosophy. I focused on some of the core concepts and practices I feel are worth having in the forefront of the mind while engaging with Thelemic materials, including Crowley's thoughts on channeling genius, the skeptical approach, and discipline in mystical and magical practices.
Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Thanks for joining me. So today we're going to be talking about the philosophy of Thelema. And this isn't intended to be like a completely comprehensive discussion of Thelema or anything like that. I think that it's important to actually read the books, engage with the materials, all that sort of thing. And this is not meant to be kind of like a replacement for that by any means. More so, what I was kind of interested in doing with this is to have the opportunity to discuss Thelema generally and that sort of thing, but also sort of go over some things to keep an eye out for as you engage with Thelemic texts. So, like, for instance, some of us have been having discussions lately about just the way in which ideas can become degenerated, so to speak. So, for instance, the idea of, like, if we have a centralized representation of a philosophical system versus if we have a whole bunch of individuals kind of doing their own take on things. And here with Toronto Thelema, the whole idea behind Toronto Thelema is kind of just to have it as a community-supported thing so that it's all of us in the community having the amount of engagement that we choose. And it's not like a hierarchical system per se. It's not like an organized system per se, although there is, some degree of organization just to keep the thing going. It's not connected to any other groups or organizations. So it's theoretically open-minded to everybody in the community and everybody having their perspective and being able to bring that to the table. I've recently been saying that I think of myself as being quote-unquote orthodox. I don't know why I'm quoting myself. Orthodox and pluralist. And what I mean by that is orthodox to Thelema in that I go back to the Book of the Law and I go back to Crowley's writings. But, I mean, Thelema should be transgressive by its very nature, so the idea of orthodoxy to that is a bit of a, it's something that's not just, I'm not going to be just going by, no, you should be doing the things this way or anything like that. So there's already a certain amount of unorthodoxy, let's say, or heterodoxy, inherent in that system. But the pluralist aspect, it's being open to everybody who's coming into the environment and bringing their ideas. And the idea that I have, the take that I have on it, is the idea that everybody has their own hadith, their own star at their center, their own sort of central will, their own central source of expression that they're engaging with the universe with. And I stand to benefit from everybody else's hadith having their experiences so that I don't have to necessarily. I can experience the world and life in my own way and share that with others, and they can do likewise for me, and I can benefit from that discourse. So that's where I'm coming from with that. That being said, if we take on one extreme a sort of hierarchical approach or a sort of like this is the way it's supposed to be, and then if we take on the other extreme of things, everybody can do their own thing, we stand to lose sight of what's important on either of those two ends. Because when people are coming up with their own approach to things, then everybody's not necessarily going to agree, but more importantly, you lose kind of the essence of the thing at some point. I've noticed quite a bit, like online over the years, for instance, you'll have somebody who's got an opinion on something, who says something that really is meaningful or, has power or gets a real good idea across. And then their sort of followers are parroting that same idea back and forth, but then it becomes slanted or it becomes misinterpreted. It gets reinterpreted and sort of thrown back out in a new form. And so like you have things just degenerating in this way. So having some way of going back to the original source is kind of handy for that reason. And I think that's a big part of what Thelema is supposed to be designed for to some extent. Inevitably, we have to look at this in terms of, we can use this comparison, other religious systems. Whether or not Thelema is a religion, I'm not interested in discussing. You can either see it that way or you can decide not to, but we can compare it because there are certain qualities that it does share in common with other religious systems. For instance, if we were to look at Christianity, you can clearly see that, well, the closest we can get to Jesus' actual words as the prophet of that religion is the Gospels. So unless, of course, there's like non-canonical books and whatnot, but if we just take as the four Gospels as the closest that you can get to it, then it's already degenerated to the point where it's word of mouth, and even there, we have the four slightly differing ideas of things. And then same thing with like Islam. That's closer because you have a direct channeling of a book from the Archangel Gabriel through the prophet to book form. So theoretically, this is going to maintain it in a stronger way. But either way, it's like, oh, Jesus, save me from your followers kind of thing, where it's like the thing gets degenerated and people can basically commandeer the idea and make it into whatever they want. So we end up with a problem. And when it comes to Thelema, the Book of the Law, by Crowley's claims, was channeled by him, or should I say received by him, because he described I was as this voice speaking in the corner to him, reciting the Book of the Law. And
it's talking about his partner, right?
What's that?
It's talking about his partner, right?
Well, no. That's one of the narratives on the subject, is that Rose Kelly was channeling it, right? And I think, like, I've heard that Stephen Skinner was kind of writing it that way in his introduction to Book 4. I have not read his version of Book 4, but so this is completely hearsay on my part, but that doesn't actually accord at all with what Crowley describes. What Crowley describes is that he went into the room by himself, sat at the table between 12 o'clock and 1 o'clock p.m., on through the 3 successive days, sat there, heard the voice speaking in the corner behind him, and wrote down what he heard. And that's pretty much how it went. So by his claim, it wasn't Rose Kelly, but I was dictating to him from a shadowy corner. And part of the confusion might come from the fact that there were a couple of words in the Book of the Law that were corrected by Rose Kelly. We've got an example right there where in Rose Kelly's own hand, there's a word or two that are added in to correct or confirm what was misheard by Crowley, or whatever the case may have been at that time. So in that case, it made sense because Rose Kelly was getting something coming through her. So she was channeling this spirit and guiding Crowley, for instance, to the Stele of Revealing in the Bullock Museum. But the idea that she was dictating it doesn't actually accord with what Crowley was saying. And unfortunately, Crowley's is the only first-hand eyewitness representation of this event. We don't have anything from Rose Kelly. And she would have been the only other possible person, I think, to be able to confirm or deny. Okay, so the idea behind the Book of the Law, though, in its own words, is that this book will be reproduced always to include the writing of the prophets. So it's always supposed to have the facsimile of the book, the manuscript, included with it, which is a great innovation for the idea of trying to maintain the teachings of the Book of the Law and the ideas that come through it, and more importantly, the things that aren't necessarily overt, that may be implicit or hidden within the text. Whether or not that actually succeeds, time will tell. It could be that in the next 20 years, all copies of the Book of the Law are wiped out, or in the next 100 years, or the next 200 years, and it's lost to time. That's always a possibility. I mean, just as a precedent for that, Jack Parsons channeled his what he claimed was the 4th chapter of the Book of the Law. It was the chapter spoken in the voice of Babylon, and it ended up being the Book of Babylon or something along those lines. I forget exactly what he called it. But it was like that does still exist almost. There's portions of it that have been just, lost. And we're lucky that even, there's so many things of Jack Parsons that we did lose, including some audio recordings and whatnot that unfortunately Cameron, his partner, after his death, had, in emotional fits at various points, had destroyed stuff and might have destroyed more had there not been other friends there to stop her and that sort of thing. But either way, that's a precedent for, we don't have the entirety of that chapter, which he claims was chapter 4 of the Book of the Law. Okay, but just to bring things around here, what is the deal with Thelema? I didn't mean to go into Jerry Seinfeld mode there, but who are these entities? So I don't want to go over the whole breakdown of Thelema means will, and will equates to 93, and also agape, which, I don't want to go through to that extent of things. I want to take a look at this from the angle of view of where Crowley was coming from after he had been in the Golden Dawn, the magical group, the Golden Dawn, where he got his magical chops. That group kind of fell apart, as groups often do. And after, in the wake of the Golden Dawn falling apart, he traveled the world. He ended up getting married to Rose Kelly and then having the Book of the Law dictated to him by Aiwaz. And after that point, he ended up at some point getting back in touch with George Cecil Jones, and the two of them started collaborating on the idea of putting together different projects, including a kind of replacement for the Golden Dawn, which was the AA system. And that is the magical system that, instead of being prone to the social ills that the Golden Dawn was, where you end up with a group of people, as Crowley put it, you get enough people in a room together, eventually they'll start basically making fun of each other's hats. And so, eventually you have gossip happening, you have infighting and that sort of thing. So the idea behind the AA was that you would be initiated by your neophyte. They would help you to be trained along the way. A lot of it's, you're doing your work, so it's not like you're being coddled along or anything like that. But you have your neophyte bringing you up, and you would be bringing your student up, and that's all you would know. It doesn't really work that way in practice because, it's difficult to organize these kinds of things, and people eventually meet each other in person and that sort of thing to some extent or another, but that's the goal. So Crowley and George Cecil Jones were putting this thing together, and with that in mind, and they eventually started working on, Crowley put out the Equinox, which was the publication putting out all kinds of ritual texts and short stories and poems and that sort of thing as well, but he saw it as a vessel to keep these important teachings of the Golden Dawn in the public and just surviving in the case of some cataclysmic conflict to come. this being just before World War I, and of course World War II following, 20 years after that or 15 years after that. With that, we look at the equinox. It's described as the Journal of Scientific Illuminism, which sounds like probably a turnoff these days because of the fact that there's so many groups that sound kind of wacko with these kinds of terms that are a little bit obfuscating and whatnot. But if we look at it, the Journal of Scientific Illuminism, the idea behind it is the method of science and the aim of religion. So it's approaching spirituality with a scientific attitude. What if there is something more underlying our reality, or something, spiritual going on that we can actually get in touch with, and we actually treated it seriously and scientifically instead of politically or however else we want to think of it. Crowley was drawing on a lot of his practices in Buddhism and yoga and, of course, the Golden Dawn practices and that sort of thing. So his idea was to be very syncretic, which is following in the steps of the Golden Dawn. And a lot of the Western occult people, or even philosophers, going back to Schopenhauer, where they brought a lot of ideas from the East, and as they were filtered into the West, they tried to find the commonalities, assuming that there was something like a nature, an underlying nature that all these systems were looking at, that they could glean, sort of get a better look at from the lens of combining these different sort of systems and approaches. But if we look at that as the idea of, okay, if we take the scientific process to approaching spirituality, I want to sort of look at two things that stick out in terms of Crowley's writings and this whole approach of the AA and the equinox at that time. So the two particular ideas are the idea of discarnate intelligences. So the idea of like intelligences that aren't in flesh bodies. So are there spirits? Are there demons? Are there other beings that we can communicate with? This is kind of the theory behind Magick in a big way. And he says that this is kind of the upshot of astral work. This is what we're doing with astral work, is trying to communicate with intelligences. The other side of things is the idea of genius, as he put it. And the term genius, I think, is probably at that time much more influenced by the traditional Greek term, the daemon, basically being the ingenium, the higher self. Sometimes it's described as, or it could be just inspiration. But it becomes troublesome to find correct definitions for this thing. And so Crowley kind of tries to avoid getting too hard and fast with it. But he does describe the idea of channeling genius. So when you're really having a heavy output of creativity, when you're really in the sweet spot, when you're really in the zone with something, there's something that feels viscerally different than when you're intellectualizing things and very sort of heavy-handedly trying to make something happen. Well, what's the difference? And how do we analyze that? How do we understand it? And how do we learn how to better control or direct it? How do we channel that genius? I think a lot of musicians tend to think of when I'm writing music, you can see interviews with musicians where they're talking about, I'm just letting it come through me. I'm channeling it. It doesn't feel like it's me doing it. Sometimes it can even get to the point of not taking credit for it. It's working through me and that sort of thing. I think this is a common thing for artists to be able to feel that. And I think Crowley actually did appreciate the fact that art was the quickest way to achieve magical ends in a lot of ways. Obviously, depending on what kind of magic you're trying to achieve. So we have these two ideas, the idea of discarnate intelligences and the idea of genius. These are two things that were very strongly in Crowley's writings, right up until Magick Without Tears, which is one of the last things he wrote. When it comes to discarnate beings, the idea of intelligences separate from ourselves. If we've already decided that there aren't, and that we live in a mechanistic kind of world, great. You don't have to worry about it. It's kind of fun to play with the idea, even if you're not really bought into it yet. So let's just play with the idea. And this is one of the things that I want to emphasize as well, is like, it's not important to decide what the truth is yet. In fact, that's one of the most important things I want to get across, is the idea of being able to accept that you don't know. I think this is one of the things that people have trouble with without being able to really recognize it, is like accepting not knowing. And it's actually a powerful thing too, because then you can just sort of like, okay, you don't have to worry about if you're right or wrong. You can accept that you don't know. What do they need to do right now to fix all those problems? I don't know. It's not that simple. So we could think of it like, if we kind of accept the idea that there's these separate intelligences from us, we could think, maybe these are parts of our own mind. So if we feel like we're able to actually get into communication with things, maybe they're parts of our own mind. Well, why would we even start with that supposition? Well, let's say if you pick up a copy of Liber, like we have on the table there, you can start doing some practices, and you may get nothing out of it. So nothing lost, nothing gained. Or you may find that you have certain experiences. Crowley says that there's not much danger of even the most basic beginner running into the problem of not having any kind of success. The bigger problem comes from success, because once you start having successes, it can kind of, that can generate its own problems, including kind of going off the deep end, reading too much into your success. Like, oh my God, you guys have to listen to this. This is important, So actually, I think that's one of the other things that I really want to get across as well, is the idea of not, like it says in Liber, not investing too much importance, or the amount of importance in your results that they at first seem to have. And learning to be a little bit more scientific in that sense, being able to stay a little bit objective, allow some time as you're getting these results before you get, you come to any determinations. And success is your proof. If you have success, wonderful. So what? If you've got spirits talking to you, so what? If they're telling you you're the greatest person in the world, so what? Does that change reality? Does it mean anything ultimately? Do you actually gain something from it? What do you gain from it? So this is one of the things you got to ask yourself is, okay, what am I getting from these results? Am I getting a bigger ego? Am I getting myself into trouble because I'm acting very erratic and socially distancing people from me and whatever else? That may not be the results that you should be looking for. Okay, but they could be parts of the mind, and if they are parts of the mind, so much the more important that you should be hesitating before going off the deep end, assuming that, this is more important than it may actually be. It could be that they are parts of the mind, and this is an opportunity to actually engage with those parts of your mind, and you could be resolving complexes within yourself. That could be a legitimate, actual way of actually using ritual practice for your self-benefit. In fact, Crowley actually, when he published, it was actually Mathers had put together the Goetia, and Crowley published it without his consent, and included an introduction and an invocation, basically, cursing Mathers, but in cipher script. But in his introduction to it, Crowley talked about the Goetia, specifically describing the demons of the Goetia as parts of the brain. And I think that, unfortunately people constantly refer to that because having read that, you assume, well, Crowley thought that the demons of the Goetia were parts of the brain. And yes, he did at that time. And this is before, I believe it was, he published this before the reception of the Book of the Law. Now that's important because that was still very early in his life. And the events leading up to the reception of the Book of the Law, at that time, he describes himself as very much the Buddhist and very much the nihilist, frankly. He didn't believe any of this stuff really mattered that much, ultimately. It didn't really get him anywhere, it seemed like. So he was actually invoking the sylphs in the Great Pyramid, in the King's Chamber of the Great Pyramid for Rose Kelly, not because, look at this, look, this proves it, you've got to understand that there's something important here. No, he was claiming to have done it because he was pointing out to her, what's the use? There they are. So what? Big deal. Doesn't actually make a difference. So he was in this kind of a state of mind when he ended up receiving the Book of the Law. And even when he did receive the Book of the Law, it took him a long time to actually take it seriously. He even lost it in his attic and only found the manuscript again when he was looking for his skis in 1906, I think. And he stumbled across it along with some of his Enochian paraphernalia. So that being said, he pretty much was thinking of the goetic demons as parts of the brain at that time. And we got to remember that people are not in a condition of stasis. You can describe a person as a noun, but that's kind of a mistake because it's reductionist. We fundamentally exist as changing patterns, ever-changing patterns. And it's questionable where exactly that pattern is separate from its environment. So, another way we could take a look at this idea of these discarnate entities, these intelligences that are separate from our bodies or physical manifestations. We could think of them as separate, legitimately separate intelligences. Whether or not they are what they represent themselves to be, we should treat them with the same respect and boundaries as we would any intelligent and potentially dangerous being. So, somewhat akin to the idea that, well, if we're engaging with something like this, then we should treat it on its own terms. It's sort of equivalent, I guess, to, you don't really need to get too hung up on what you believe, frankly. This is something to keep in mind throughout this whole thing. It's not as important what you believe because what you believe may change. And if it doesn't change, then you might not be doing the work properly. That could be an indicator of that. One example of that is sort of like if you picture exorcisms. There's that idea that if it seems like all the indicators of an exorcism, of a possession, a spirit possession, seem to be indicating a true possession, then if you treat it as if it's real, bring in the exorcists, do the thing, then that can be effective. So go with it. Success is your proof. Use what works. Treat it on its terms. That's another way we can take a look at this. So it's essentially like as if you're dealing with this thing as if, and you don't have to pass judgment yet. You can wait until after the fact, until you've got all the records down, and by God, you should be keeping records. If you don't keep records, then what are you going to look back at? How are you going to be able to gauge what's real and what isn't? The third way we could see these things, or item C, if I could return to my lettering system, these could be products of our imagination. Absolutely legitimate. We could be dealing with just products of our imagination. And this seems to vary from person to person from what I can gauge, because I'm fascinated by just sort of seeing what kind of results different people will get. Some people have very clearly, or at least the way that they're conveying it is very clearly discrete experiences of separate beings. Other people describe it's essentially like an imaginative exercise. And usually they have a hard time kind of having a proper conversation because it's like, no, you're lying. Or there's a disconnect. And in all things these days, it's like, it seems like we have to choose a side. Like we're rooting for our sports team or something like that. Again, I think it's important that we can accept when we don't know. So the subjective nature of our experience may delude us. We could suffer from and feed into hallucinations. we could become obsessed by the apparent meaning, importance, trustworthiness, truth of our experiences. And I've already kind of alluded to this. That's the kind of thing we got to be careful of, because any of us at the best of times can fall victim to this. I think it's a folly to assume that we have mental illness and then we have mental health. It can be useful for certain contexts, but I think there's such a gradient to this. And again, we don't exist in a continuous stasis, a condition of stasis or something like that. I think things that we think of as mental illness are ever present, whether latent or not, for all of us. And the more latent they are, the less we can see them, the more likely we are to have them kind of sneak up on us. So, again, that objectivity comes to mind. So the idea of not getting too hung up on things and being able to sort of stay a little bit objective, a little bit not completely engaged, which is difficult because to some extent you need to be engaged. What we are using here is our mind as the chief tool for our engagement with these things. I mean, obviously we're using magical weapons, we're using magical circles, candles, incense, we're using whatever else that may be at our disposal for these things. But all of it is filtered through and working with our consciousness. And these other separate consciousnesses as well are working with our consciousness in order to communicate. So I would say in all of these cases, whether we think of these as parts of our own mind, whether we think of them as legitimate separate intelligences, or if we think of them as products of our imagination, it's good for us to have three things in the forefront of our mind. One, discipline. And discipline can be a kind of an umbrella to cover a lot of things. It basically, the fundamental practices that we start with in Liber, for instance, are, and Liber, which we don't have copies of here, but goes pretty hand in hand with Liber. In Thelema, we tend to use yoga practices to still the body and then increasingly still the mind. And just doing this alone gives some discipline. It sort of helps to get the mind to quiet, because if the mind is what we're using to a great extent, then if it's in a chaotic state and it's going mad, then it doesn't help if, we might be having auditory hallucinations, or we can't tell the difference if we're having auditory hallucinations and whatnot. So it helps to be able to gain some kind of clarity so we can tell the difference. Still things so that we have some ability to be receptive to other sources of information. And also so we can control our focus of mind. So like a lot of what we do with yoga is trying to hold an image in mind and maintain it. And that's it. A lot of it can involve union with these images that we create in our mind and that sort of thing. And that can teach us quite a bit about the nature of mind and the nature of ourselves. But with what we're talking about here, a great deal of it is just the discipline of the mind. Disciplines can also include magic, which is, instead of going inwards like mysticism and yoga, magic is more of an outward sort of thing, assuming that we're dealing with a duality, myself and other, and engaging with that in different ways. But we also could use skepticism. So skepticism, constantly kind of being in second-guessing things, doubting things, not in an overly destructive way, but in a way that's going to keep us constantly digging deeper. So from The Soldier and the Hunchback, Crowley gives a sort of rundown on skepticism. He says, inquiry. Let us inquire in the first place. What is skepticism? The word means looking, questioning, investigating. One must pass by contemptuously the Christian liar's gloss, which interprets skeptic as mocker. Though in a sense it is true for him, since to inquire into Christianity is assuredly to mock at it. But I am concerned to intensify the etymological connotation in several respects. First, I do not regard mere incredulity as necessary to the idea. though credulity is incompatible with it. Incredulity implies a prejudice in favor of a negative conclusion, and the true skeptic should be perfectly unbiased. So we're not just saying, I don't believe it. We're not just constantly sort of fighting against things. It's not like there's these arguments between Christians and atheists, for instance, that are kind of silly. As far as I'm concerned. I'm sure they think it's getting them somewhere. But, for instance, the atheist idea of just denial of things, or the Christian idea of just denial of the opposite and that sort of thing. We're not interested in that. We're interested in the idea of using skepticism to constantly basically get yourself an objective position on things. So like if you are engaging with a spirit, at the moment it might be best just to go with it and completely buy into it and get excited about the thing and really get the full experience out of it. And then after it's done, write your record up before any time passes so you don't lose track of anything. Then do nothing. Don't go, prove that you can fly by jumping off the side of a building or something like that. Give it some time. Reassess it. Look back over your record and see. Try to interpret it from a couple different angles. Because sometimes these things are hyperbolous, or sometimes they do give you the impression that there's something really important there. But you might be able to look at it in a couple of different ways. And that skepticism can help you with that. So The Soldier and the Hunchback, incidentally, for those who haven't read it, is the soldier is the exclamation point, standing erect and marching along. So it's the aha moment, the insight. The hunchback follows as the question mark. The wait a second, what if, what about, or what? Constantly digging deeper. And then the aha that you get from digging deeper. And you have this constant stream of question marks and exclamation marks. And so it's not like you're reaching an end goal. Again, it's okay to not know. As far as I'm concerned, at least. I think it's important to not know. You can go back to the ancient Greeks, and their whole idea is like, the one thing that I know is that I know nothing. These kinds of ideas. Incidentally, I'll read also from the Book of Lies. Crowley says on faith versus doubt, the more necessary anything appears to my mind, the more certain it is that I only assert a limitation. The more necessary something appears to my mind, the more certain it is that I'm asserting a limitation. So it's like a boundary wall that you're not willing to go beyond because you've figured it out. You've got the answer. You know. So the next aha moment has to break that down, and it might just require that question to do it. So that's what we're talking about with skepticism. So between discipline and skepticism, we have the workings of the Thelemic approach. The third thing I have here is Kabbalah, and that's because this offers us our language with which to engage with the spiritual entities. We need a language because that's how our brains work. The more time goes on and the more things I study and the more I observe and analyze the learning process, the more I appreciate the fact that language is an incredibly focal part of the way in which our brains work and engage with reality, for better or for worse. There's the doctrine of the ape of Thoth, which is Thoth is the god of wisdom who brought science and magic and language to humanity. But there's also the ape of Thoth, which is the idea that things like language also bring not just communication, but miscommunication, misunderstanding, mistakes. This is important. And this is why, I think in the, Liber 2, the Book of the Magus, Liber B vel Magi. It's basically the idea that you, as a magus, would be pretty much cursed to tell a lie. in order, well, actually tell the truth, which is a lie, which is the truth, which is a lie, it's the nature of communication, that this thing will not be any longer directly rooted in truth. So we have discipline, skepticism, and Kabbalah for our language. So learning the Kabbalah, and particularly Hermetic Kabbalah, and the way that it was taught in the Golden Dawn, and the way that it's kind of come forward through that system, and through the teachers of it ever since then, is our language with which we equip ourselves to be able to become conversational with the spirits. And to be conversational in a language, you have to get it in your blood. Like, you can't just... I remember somebody describing what it takes to learn a new language, and it's basically, well, you learn the grammar, and then you start gaining vocabulary, and that's pretty much what it would take to learn a language. And it doesn't work that way. It just doesn't work that way. You'd think it would. Logically it would. It doesn't. Because our brains don't work that way. Otherwise, little children would have to learn grammar and vocabulary first in order to speak. They don't. When we speak conversationally, we don't sit there thinking about, like right now, I'm not thinking about sentence structure and vocabulary. I'm speaking. To be conversational with something, it has to be in your blood. So it's an expression of yourself. Same thing with the Kabbalah. You basically want to work at it, and this is the way Crowley talks about it, is that you want to have it so much in your blood that it is just a natural expression of things. He uses the exercise in Magick Without Tears of you walking down the street. You see a red brick house. You think red is Geburah, and Geburah is 5, and it can be the pentagram. It can be the god of war, Mars. You start giving yourself all these correspondences to things, and you're putting them on the tree of life, because the tree of life in Kabbalah is our filing system for all these ideas. And that also is the way that our brains work. You get a sensation. Maybe it's like the smell of strawberries. It shoots your brain over to this place where it had associations with that. If it's been all since last summer, since you smelled strawberries, then it's going to bring you back. Oh, man, yeah, that's, it gives you all these connections to the filing cabinets that are all in that area of your brain. And that's pretty much what the Kabbalah is making use of. There's ancient exercises for this as well, like using... mental visualizations to go into a house and a room and into these different places to build correspondences. And that's good, because then it comes more instantaneously. You want it to come instantaneously. This is one of the things that I'll teach when I'm teaching music is why in school did they make us learn the times tables? What's 6 times 6?
36.
Why did you not stop and think about it for a second?
It's programmed.
Exactly, just reaction. So that's a different part of your brain than the part that has to do the math. What's 36 times 36?
482.
Oh.
Please,
Don't check your calculator. He's absolutely... No, but you see what I mean, though? It's like if you have to do the actual math in your head, you'll feel the difference, because your brain will be burning energy. That part of your brain is a supercomputer, but it uses a lot of energy, and it can only do one thing at a time, pretty much. So there's other parts of your brain, your mind, yourself, like your muscle memory, that just, you learn it. That automatically happens. It frees your brain up so it doesn't have to burn so much energy. If your brain had to micromanage every single little thing, then yeah, you wouldn't get anywhere. Burn out very quickly. Now, knowing that, you can observe it, and you can make better use out of it. So just being self-aware of things like this, becoming more aware of the different parts of your brain and that they exist at all, is a good starting point. So I'm going to posit that even if you're an atheist, a mechanistic atheist, thinking that spiritual stuff is silly, you can still get use out of these exercises, these practices. The yoga exercises, the some of the stuff in Liber, just the mental exercises or the ability to observe, just start to watch the workings of your own mind. You gain a lot from that. So going back to the idea of genius, I kind of want to start with that rather than the spiritual entities and stuff. The faculty of genius may be cultivated. So the idea that there is this flow, you're in the zone and there's things flowing through you, you can facilitate that. What gets in the way of it? Well, I mean, if you're trying to do something artistic and that sort of thing, it's usually when you get in your head. If you're thinking about things, that part of you thinks that is you. And it's not. It's just one part. This is one of the reasons that we run into problems with the ego, one of the reasons. But the ego, incidentally, is not a problem per se. It's when things are out of proportion that things are a problem. So when you think that's you, that mathy part of you, it can get in the way. It's like when you were first learning to ride a bike and you were like, I'm doing it, and then you think about what you're doing and it's gone. And you're on your face. If you're riding a bike for years and it's just second nature, you're not thinking about it anymore. It is an extension of your body.
It's also the lust after the result.
There you go, lust of result. Yeah, when you're thinking about it, when you get in your head, when you're lusting after it, you get in the way of it. When it's flowing, that is that genius, let's call it the genius flowing through you. It's your consciousness coming through it. It becomes an extension of your body. If you're driving a car, the first time you're driving it, you have to think about every little thing, check your mirrors, check your blind spots, every little motion. When you have been driving for years, it is an extension of your body. You're not thinking about those things. You are making the car do what you want it to do, and it is an extension of your body. Video games, same thing. You have to think about the controls at first, but once you've been doing it enough, you are the character on the screen. So that's like the consciousness extending out through those things. It is doing the same thing with your body. This is what I would claim. Your body, your physical body right now, is no different from that. It's like your consciousness has been extending out into this body and controlling it since you were born. So you have the illusion, you have a lack of consciousness of it being that same process. And so, hey, maybe you can facilitate this process, particularly when it comes to doing things well. Crowley uses the example of like golf, where you're getting the perfect kind of like slice or whatever, and making the ball do what you want it to do. Same sort of thing. It's like you have to think about all these things. If you actually had to think of all the mechanics of what your arms are doing in that, then it would be a bit nuts to have to micromanage all of that. But when you really get the knack, he calls it the knack, be in the zone or whatever, the flow state. That's something that he had a big preoccupation with, is the idea of channeling genius. And for him, it was like he was so prolific with writing, with creativity, that it was something he was good at. And so he was very interested in when it wasn't as strong as at other times. So a big part of Thelema we can think of as facilitating the genius, and we kind of take it to the next extreme, because we could think of it just in terms of like the creative act, and we should, I think, because that's really handy. We can be observing the functions of the body and that sort of thing, the functions of the mind. But we also get to the idea that if you really want to understand how to put all these parts of your mind in balance so we can be a better vessel for that genius, we could become a rod that is a hollow tube in which to steal fire from heaven. That could be the genius coming through. And to put ourselves into a balanced state that facilitates that flow, we can think of initiation as that process. So Crowley talks about initiation, to no end, frankly, but we could take a look at a very brief little statement here. He's talking about the passage from the Book of the Law. The cobs is in the coup, not the coup in the cobs. That's chapter 1, verse 8. And that might not mean much to somebody who's never heard passages from the Book of the Law before, but basically the cobs is like the light. We'll say the fire from heaven in this case, in the analogy. And the Ku is like the spiritual body of the individual. So let's call it the hollow tube in this analogy. Crowley says of this passage, the doctrine here taught is that the light is innermost. And he quotes from, various places, but in particular the Vision of the Voice, intra nobis regnum Dei. And he says intra, not extra. Within us is the kingdom of God. And he's quoting that's a quote from Jesus, incidentally. I think it's amusing how often Crowley will quote from or reference Jesus, as much as he had vitriol at the ideas because of the problems of the Christian church and the Christian teachings and whatnot. And yet, in that passage there, for instance, intra nobis regnum Dei, it actually, in the Vision of the Voice, it's amongst a series of little groups of words that are shadowing forth the I-N-R-I magical formula. In that case, it's intra I, nobis N, regnum R, Dei. Well, it has a capital I at the end of it instead of a capital D, so that's where that's coming from. But the kingdom of God is within us, which I never understood why people don't think about that more, especially Christians in particular, because most of the Christians that I talk to seem to lose track of that. Seems like one of the most important teachings. But in a later comment, Crowley says, the uninitiate is a dark star, quote unquote, and the great work for him is to make his veils transparent by purifying them, quote unquote. This purification is really simplification. It is not that the veil is dirty, but that the complexity of its folds makes it opaque. The great work, therefore, consists principally in the solution of complexes. He likes the term complexes, by the way. I think he got it from Freud, but it's kind of a handy one in this analogy for sure. It's the idea of the complexity of these folds, and this is why we lose track of that inner light. We can't see it because we're separated by the folds of ourselves, that lack of balance and harmony within. So the process of initiation is essentially regaining that balance, straightening out the folds. He says everything in itself is perfect, but when things are muddled, they become, quote unquote, evil. The word evil kind of brings to mind the fact that in Thelema, morality is relative. He particularly hits on this in Magick Without Tears. That's important. People, I like to reference Nietzsche, and I think people have a problem with Nietzsche because as soon as it comes up, people have a tendency to think adolescent male,
It's like Rick and Morty.
Yeah. And it's like, so people have an association there, right? But this is the problem. We have oversimplification of ideas, and something that I'd wanted to get across at the beginning of the talk. I don't remember if I actually ended up doing that, but we tend to have to oversimplify things in order to keep track of them. It's like an entire religion can be summed up in one word. An entire group of people can be summed up in one word for our minds so that we can deal with that information in a simplified fashion. We can't handle the complexities of these things because our brains will overheat. And so it's hard to do justice to any one topic. And the problem that we run into with that, in this case, I'm talking about Nietzsche, and it's like, there's so much value to Nietzsche. And I think it's such a shame that we can't talk about it, we can't really get the complete value out of it without it getting sidelined by, dismissiveness and kind of like, oh, well, Nietzsche, that's like, for angry adolescent boys, or whatever the case may be. It's like, no, you're not getting it. There's a lot there. And Crowley described Nietzsche as he could be thought of as a prophet of Thelema, and I think there's incredibly important reasons why. Nietzsche thought of himself as a herald of the philosopher of the future. He wasn't the philosopher of the future, but he was a herald of the philosopher of the future. And when he said God is dead, that was taken out of a passage that was describing somebody racing through town saying, God is dead, and everybody was ignoring him. And he said, God is dead and we have killed him. Because all of philosophy up until that point had reduced things to such a state where inevitably it had to confront the fact that there was nothing. It was leading towards nihilism. And Nietzsche saw this and tried to warn people about it. But they went there anyway, and we ended up with nihilism and existentialism. So he was right. But people just, attribute these things. Again, we have to simplify things and misunderstand them as a result. We have that ape of thought going on. So again, we have the degeneration of the idea and misrepresentation as well as a result. Now, when we're talking about the genius, I want to think about this. We're starting to work towards the idea of the holy guardian angel. This is the example par excellence of the genius working through the individual. And this is the end goal. Well, not the end goal. There is no end. The end is the purpose, and the purpose is present here now. Let me try and get back on track here. The HGA, or Holy Guardian Angel, is the central purpose of the AA system and the system of initiation that Crowley envisioned here, because that is essentially the process of initiation that we are aligning and harmonizing ourselves in order to create a vessel, a temple in which God can indwell and genius can come through us. And that genius can take the form of the Holy Guardian Angel, which we can describe as this separate entity that at the same time seems to have the qualities of the higher self, a separate, discrete being, maybe a being that could be incarnated on the earth for all we can tell, or just our deepest personal selves. Who knows? Let's not get too hung up on that. In fact, let's not give it a definition that's too hard and fast. Crowley talked about this in a few different ways. I'm going to start with a couple of passages from Moonchild, because I really like these passages. This is his character, Simon If. And Simon If is Crowley's idealization of what he wished he could be if he could just be completely a Taoist, and like a wise Taoist sage. So Simon If, he would also go on to write books about Simon If that were based on him being essentially like the type of Sherlock Holmes, a detective that would solve crimes and practice Taoism. But this passage, he's describing the idea of the genius to somebody. He says, "The only analogy is that of a noble thinker and his stupid, dishonest, and immoral secretary." So the noble thinker being the genius, and the stupid, dishonest, immoral secretary being us, the individual person through which the genius is trying to work. The dictation is taken down correctly and given to the world. The last person to be enlightened by it is the secretary himself. So, I take it, is the case with all genius. Only in many cases the man is in more or less conscious harmony with his genius and strives eternally to make himself a worthier instrument for his master's touch. The clever man, so called, the man of talent, shuts out his genius by setting up his conscious will as a positive entity. That sort of relates to what I was talking about, us getting in the way of this flow. It's like learning to trust so we can use faith. Well, I'll come back to that later. The idea of being able to be the vehicle for this thing at first is distasteful because it means that you're giving up control, maybe. It means that you're relegating yourself to a position of subservience or something, that could be problematic for us. That could be difficult to deal with at the outset. So he goes on, the true man of genius deliberately subordinates himself, reduces himself to a negative, and allows his genius to play through him as it will. This, which is truth ascertained and certain, lies at the base of the Taoist doctrine of non-action. The plan of doing everything by seeming to do nothing. Yield yourself utterly to the will of heaven, and you become the omnipotent instrument of that will. Thy will be done. Thy will, which is mine. There is no difference. Most systems of mysticism have a similar doctrine, but that it is true in action is only properly expressed by the Chinese. Nothing that any man can do will improve that genius, but the genius needs his mind, and he can broaden that mind, fertilize it with knowledge of all kinds, improve its powers of expression, supply the genius, in short, with an orchestra instead of a tin whistle. All our little great men, our one-poem poets, our one-picture painters, have merely failed to perfect themselves as instruments. So, the idea is that we can perfect ourselves as instruments. Now, we can also continue with his little passage here. He says, I don't say, went on the mystic, that the genius and his artist are not inseparably connected. It may be a little more closely than the horse and its rider. Well, that sounds familiar. It's sort of what I was talking about with the vehicle being the extension of our body, the video game being the extension of our body, the body being an extension of our will. But there is at least a distinction to be drawn. And here is a point for you to consider. The genius appears to have all knowledge, all illumination, and to be limited merely by the powers of his medium's mind. Even this is not always a bar. How often do we see a writer gasp at his own work? I never knew that, he cries, amazed, although only a minute previously he has written it down in plain English. In short, the genius appears to be a being of another plane, a soul of light and immortality. I know that much of this may be explained by supposing that what I have called the genius to be a bodily substance in which the consciousness of the whole race, in this particular time, may become active under certain stimuli. There is much to be said for this view. That's kind of interesting because that just seems to allude to almost like a Jungian idea of the race consciousness, or the overall thing that we're all partaking in. With discipline, some of the things that he talks about are restraint of conflict, restraint of discipline. I mean, that sounds self-explanatory, but restraint of art. And what he's talking about here, I'm referencing de hoc modo dissolutio, which I think should be dissoluzione. But that's from Liber. It's chapter Zeta Nun. And he's talking about the three forms of restraint. Restraint of conflict, which is impotence and disruption. So conflict, obviously, that's impotence and disruption, because that's, the chaos that we usually find ourselves in. I mean, how many times have you tried to do something, move in a certain direction, assert your will in a certain way, and you are unable to do anything about it? And maybe even things fight back. So a lot of the problems that we run into from the outset is the fact that we're in a state of chaos within our own selves. One part of us is fighting for something, and the other parts are fighting against it. Why the hell would that be? Well, it's because these are all learned reactions to stimuli that we've been carrying with us from childhood, maybe even beyond, for all we can tell. So we have learned reactions to things. We have to unlearn what we have learned, to quote an important sage, Yoda. Oh, I'm so embarrassed. There's the restraint of discipline, which is fortification of the will. And I think it's self-explanatory after what I've been talking about. We want to train ourselves in the ways that we want to train ourselves. We can think of this. I think he introduces this chapter, actually, with a particular verse of the Book of the Law in mind, which is, the word of sin is restriction. O man, refuse not thy wife if she will. O lover, if thou wilt, depart. There is no bond that can unite the divided but love. All else is a curse. Accursed be it to the aeons. Hell. Let it be that state of manyhood, bound and loathing. State of manyhood, bound and loathing. So with thy all, thou hast no right but to do thy will. Now, this idea of restraint, of discipline, and restraint of art introduces the idea that we're using sin as it appears in the Book of the Law itself. Nuit encourages us not to bind anything. Bind nothing. Let there be no difference made among you between any one thing and any other thing. However, Crowley does say here that we can use even sin itself in the sense of restriction to our own ends. After all, he describes the idea of separation, of the state of manyhood, bound and loathing. This, if we could just see it correctly, is the flirtations of Nuit with Hadit. It's her lover's play. To her, every pang of pain is a shudder of pleasure, a ripple of orgasm. But it's not, we can't see it from our point of view. We're experiencing it too separately, too discreetly. But he's saying that we can use restraint. So the restraint of discipline we can use to fortify the will. We can train all those parts of the body so we can put them in proper harmony. And he also says restraint of art, which includeth that other of discipline. And its nature is to adorn the will and to admire its strength and its beauty, and to enjoy its victory by anticipation and full confidence, not fearful of time that robbeth them that are ignorant concerning him. How he is but mirage and illusion, incapable to besiege the fortress of the soul. Work thou thy will, knowing thyself omnipotent and thine habitation eternity. O my son, attend well this word, for it is an heirloom and a ring of ruby and emerald in thine inheritance. There's some Kabbalistic stuff going on with his references there. Strength and beauty and victory. Sounds an awful lot like some Sephiroth that I know. And he ends it off with this idea is a very ring of ruby and emerald in thine inheritance. Ruby and emerald. Strength and love. Will and love. Love under will. So the idea of restraint being used as love under will.
Would that be then attributing the will itself to Guru?
Yeah,
That's interesting.
I think so.
It'd be like the vehicle for action, right? So it's like the moving of the will through your action.
Yeah. And it's reflected in Netzach, which is victory and love, but also desire. So we have them kind of crossing, I guess from your point of view, crossing the tree, crossing Tifereth between them. And it's Mars and Venus, the two lovers, who cuckolded Vulcan, poor guy.
So there still would be something in between those two that's sort of interesting, that that's a crossing place between one other will. So it would also be like a center point.
Yeah, the point of harmony between them, yeah. Yeah, so that could be something to... And the fact that he's just referring to it as an heirloom and a ring of ruby and emerald, it's kind of seems important, you know? And it'd be easy to pass by and not really invest a lot of effort or importance into. Continuing the idea of he's got 3 correctives of work: the skeptical or scientific attitude, both in outlook and in method. So being skeptical and scientific in your outlook on things and in your method of working, which is really important in a Thelemic context. Second, a healthy life, meaning by that what the athlete and the explorer mean, which is important because a lot of the time in these kinds of spiritual practices, we may forget about that. We may forget about the idea of a healthy life, keeping your body in good health. I mean, as soon as you start sitting around for too long, you find that gravity starts fucking with you, you know? Third, hearty human companionship and devotion to life, work, and duty. Yeah, and that's also kind of like not one of the first things you'd think of when thinking about discipline and that sort of thing, or the correctives of work. The idea of like, yeah, don't be too much of a hermit. Don't be too, don't be too much in your head or blasting off into space. Actually engage with, the work of your human companionship and devotion to life, work, and duty. Let him remember that an ounce of honest pride is better than a ton of false humility. Although an ounce of true humility is worth an ounce of honest pride. The man who works has no time to bother with either. And let him remember Christ's statement of the law, to love God with all thy heart and thy neighbor as thyself. Interesting. Love thy neighbor as thyself. What the fuck does that mean? There will also be another quote that I'll get to that is like the idea of, I don't want to assume that I'll get to everything because this could go overboard and I don't want to overstay my welcome here, but there's one about the idea of love thy enemy. He quotes that as well. And in fact, he says, I'm going to jump to it right now. He doesn't say that, but I say that. They all pretend to be Christians, yet the injunction, love your enemies, which, by the way, is really the first corollary of the law of Thelema, is universally regarded as infinitely objectionable.
Enemies really hate it when you give them love. It is the most upsetting thing you can do for them.
Yeah.
It's great.
Not only that, well, I'll continue what he's saying here before I insert my own opinions, but I am myself, he says, in all kinds of a mess simply because I insist upon putting this into practice. I refuse to consider my enemies as irreconcilable. I take the utmost pains to understand and love them. By this means, I invariably succeed sooner or later in destroying them. That is, of incorporating them in my own idea of myself. I cannot make the public understand that to treat a man as an enemy in the ordinary sense of the word, to damage him in every possible way, and otherwise to disintegrate him, is simply to cut off one's nose to spite one's face. There is nothing in the universe which is not indissolubly one with every other thing. This is an important aspect of Thelema as well, the idea that you are increasingly recognizing the fact that all things are an extension of yourself. You guys here, as far as I'm concerned, are an extension of myself, and I can see all kinds of things about myself in you. And the same is true for each of you with regard to me. If there's anything pissing you off about me, why don't you look at yourself first? No. Sometimes people are just dicks, but, But no, this is actually, and this is something I've particularly recently been thinking about. It's like the idea of destroying one's enemy by loving thine enemy, making it a part of yourself. And I don't think it's as easy as just, the sort of thing where you force yourself to repress your feelings and force yourself to be nice to that person or something like that. I think it's more subtle than that.
There's a difference between niceness and kindness.
Yeah.
I think, to me at least, it's like the alternative to it that's so destructive, the going to war, the engaging in the
confronting.
Wars, and how it's such a trap for one's time and energy, and it freezes you in place.
It's true, yeah.
It's impossible to engage in any kind of meaningful growth if you're preoccupied with someone who you feel has done you wrong, or it's like,
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And I think it's like the separation. Again, it's that state of manyhood, bound and loathing. It's that you separating yourself and asserting more strongly that separation between you and that other. And when you go the other way, you can unite with that other. But that's a difficult thing to put into words, especially from a Thelemic point of view, because people have difficulty with this. They don't want to get too Christian about it. But I mean, for myself, like I think everybody goes through their own discourse with this process. So I don't want to say that this is the right way to think about things. I'm just going to share with you one of the things that dawned on me recently. I was talking at, we were conversing at the only cafe there about the. I think I brought up the fact that when I started learning Latin, I started learning about the ancient Romans, and for some reason I had baggage, feeling like resentment towards the Roman Empire as somehow repressive and oppressive and this terrible sort of entity. And there's no reason I would have any baggage with the Roman Empire. They've been gone for, long enough at this point. Enough time has passed. But there's...
still comes.
Well, what I found was by learning about this stuff, the feeling I had was eating the heart of the enemy. Consuming the heart of the enemy. And I really liked that picture. I mean, it gave me it allowed me to get off on the idea that it's like, oh, well, I can make it sound badass instead of being But like, no, it's by eating the heart of the enemy. If you think about that now, if I have an enemy and I eat the heart of the enemy and make it part of myself, I consume that, add it as part of an extension of my body. That's a different kind of interplay with the environment. Gave me a different way of looking at it anyway, and I started to contemplate maybe there's actually more to that, and it's more Thelemic than I gave myself credit for, with that approach.
Should definitely write that down.
Yeah, or record it or something, yeah.
I was going to say, to love your enemy by incorporating or absorbing or even at the very essence of understanding that you are wanting the same thing, then I think can also take away from the reason that you considered them an enemy, which is something that you necessarily wouldn't want to have within yourself or have objection with from your own sense of morality. And to assimilate with that entirely is then to almost lose your sense of moral objectivity.
Aha. Now, let me see if I can restate that. So, would that fall into the context of by accepting that the aspects of this enemy I am thereby losing myself in some way or compromising myself?
I don't know.
Okay. Would it differ from that statement?
Yes.
Okay. How does it differ from that statement?
Because there's the idea of your own subjective understanding of the world that I think you wouldn't want to be compromised.
You wouldn't want to be compromised?
Yes. Whether it's something that changes over time or not, it's what you've arrived at through your own experience.
When I assert a certainty, I only assert a limitation beyond which I am not willing to go.
Maybe that's a certainty right there.
Yeah? Maybe I'm wrong.
You're only setting the plot for the next couple of chapters as well, where it gets destroyed anyway.
Yeah. This is one of the difficulties of it. It's not an easy process.
That's a fair...
Well, basically, again, it's the idea that we're not a noun per se. We're a pattern. You're at a particular state in that pattern. I can't claim to be, like, I've passed the finish line and I have it all right. You know what I mean? That's not the point. The point is the going. We have the analogy of the swan from Liber 65. It's like, why all this endless winging, said the crazy little boy. That's basically the rational mind trying to question this ecstatic bliss of the flying swan that didn't seem to be going anywhere. didn't seem to have come from anywhere, didn't have any frame of reference. And the going is itself the justification for the existence. I think this is the thing about Thelema. Well, I mean, this might get onto a tangent, I guess, so I apologize if I lose the thread, but a lot of, like when Crowley talks about, for instance, the 3 schools of Magick, he touches on some of the other perspectives, like the Buddhist perspective. The 3 schools of Magick are not identical with particular religious points of view or anything like that, but it's difficult to talk about the subject without having some kind of an example. So like the Buddhist example, for instance, is like existence is suffering. That's the conclusion that they came to. So we need to escape from suffering. The Thelemic perspective is existence includes suffering, but we choose to engage with it anyway. And ultimately the mean of existence is joy. But part of that, it does involve like the pain of losing yourself, or the fear of losing yourself can be an aspect of that. And it's something you'll go through again and again, where it's the fear. It's sort of like the fear of jumping into the water, or, you know.
Every true initiation is a funeral for yourself, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, usually in initiation, you go into an initiation fearing death, fearing whatever you're going to go through. That's kind of the idea behind it. And once you've gone through that, you discover there's not really anything to be afraid of, because you've come out the other side, and there is that which remains. So I think I think it's a completely valid point of view, and I don't want to be dismissive in any way, shape, or form of it. But in my experience, I've been down that road where I've had to let go of things and go through the fear of losing myself. Now, granted, it depends on the context, right? There's the fear of losing yourself when you're dealing with, like, uncentered energies, you know? Like if you're dealing with Kuranzon, let's say. Like something that would be of that kind of nature. That's a different story. Like losing yourself is a legitimate, you know, concern. So you got to be sure of what the hell you're doing.
So then what's the difference between that passing the abyss and saying, I've lost this part of myself versus I've lost this other part of myself?
Well, bringing it back to by way of comparison, if we bring it back to the idea of unifying with my enemy and with the fear of losing my identity or my that sort of thing, by doing that, I think that you'll find by including the other as part of yourself, you're not actually losing yourself at all. You're becoming bigger. You're including more. And when it comes to crossing the abyss, that's a bit of a different story, and it becomes very difficult to speak about clearly, because
it's interesting that's where we arrive. You know what I mean, with the example, because it's literally what we're trying to do through the process, right? So,
well, the vision of Pan happens somewhere up there, right? The idea of like including the entire universe as yourself.
Yeah.
Allah has no Allah. I want to touch on skepticism briefly, doubling back to that. One of the things I wanted to talk about was good and evil, because I think this came up in some discussions lately as well, the idea of going beyond good and evil. Returning to Nietzsche. So Nietzsche had a book called Beyond Good and Evil, and there again, he would use the term amoral. And usually these are the types of things, again, where you reduce something to a word or two and you run into trouble, because the way that people understand that at face value, superficially, amoral sounds like I don't believe in having morals or ethics. I am amoral, but amoral is not the same in his description or definition as immoral. Amoral is beyond good and evil. Good and evil is asserting duality. Things have to be either good or bad. We look at things going on in the world and we have to think, which is the good side, which is the evil side. We can't think beyond that a lot of the time. But thinking beyond good and evil, I would say, is an important aspect of Thelema, and I think it's something that helps us towards the next step for humanity as well. So this is where, in the Liber 65, it has chapter 5, verse 37, O ye that are beyond our Musdi and Arimanes, blessed are ye unto the ages. And Crowley's commentary on that is, in Persian theology, the principles of good and evil are our Musdi and Arimanes. So those are the principles of good and evil in the Persian theology. So Zoroastrianism, Zoroastrianism, that's it. Yeah. And he says, confer Nietzsche and our own doctrine expressed in many ways, in many places. So again, I think this is important stuff that's important to have in mind while you're reading Crowley's writings and reading about Thelema engaging with the material. Verse 38, they shaped doubt as a sickle. This is referring to the parricidal pomp of atheists that's referred to in an earlier verse. They shaped doubt as a sickle and reaped the flowers of faith for their garlands. They shaped ecstasy as a spear and pierced the ancient dragon that sat upon the stagnant water. Then the fresh springs were loosed, that the folk athirst might be at ease. And while we were discussing this in one of our Holy Book discussions, we discovered, it came to our attention, like, they shaped doubt as a sickle and reaped the flowers of faith for their garlands. Doubt as a sickle. A sickle is shaped like a question mark. So it's doubt as the question mark. You're questioning can reap the flowers of faith. But we don't just reap them and leave them in the path to die. We reap them for garlands to adorn ourselves with. Now, I would posit that the idea behind this is our doubt, our questioning, tears down faith, but uses faith. I really like to say, I think that belief should be used as a tool. Instead of feeling like belief has to be that limitation that you're not willing to go beyond, or that, line in the sand where you say, no, this is where I'm standing and I believe it. Or I know because I believe and this is how it is. No, I would suggest, particularly from a Thelemic standpoint, that belief is a tool which you lift up and you use and you adorn yourself with as the context requires or necessitates, whatever, and you put it away when you're done with it, in a safe place where it's not going to do any harm to children. And then they shaped ecstasy as a spear and pierced the ancient dragon that sat upon the stagnant water. Ecstasy as a spear, and a spear is the shape of an exclamation point. Ecstasy because, aha, the thrill of that insight, that experience, that breaking through. And the breaking through that leads to the fresh springs being unloosed, that the folk athirst might be at ease. And the springs being unloosed, again, we have that image of flowing. Maybe it's fire from heaven, maybe it's water. Also on the subject of beyond good and evil, there is another way of defining the great work that explains to us the whole object of manifestation, of departing from the perfection of nothing towards the perfection of everything, and one may consider this advantage, that it is quite impossible to go wrong. Every experience, whatever may be its nature, is just another necessary bump. So even when we're suffering and that sort of thing, that's still just a necessary bump in the road that will serve us ultimately in some way. Naturally, one cannot realize this until one becomes a master of the temple. Consequently, one is perpetually plunged in sorrow and despair. There is, you see, a good deal more to it than merely learning one's mistakes. One can never be sure what is right and what is wrong until one appreciates that quote-unquote wrong is equal quote-unquote right. Now then, one gets rid of the idea of quote-unquote effort, which is associated with lust of result. All that one does is to exercise pleasantly and healthfully one's energies. And he likes to use the analogy of, or we like to quote his use of the analogy of stars moving through the heavens. If they were doing their will, it'd be on their path, not conflicting with one another on their path through the heavens. And I'm also going to read this little passage about the elastic mind. These correspondences, such as they are, ought to present themselves, be judged as false or true, and rejected or accepted accordingly. The inelastic mind, on the other hand, is tied by training to a rigid sequence so that it never gets a chance to think for itself. The elastic mind is akin to the Rosicrucian injunction to wear the costume of the country in which you are traveling. This is only another way of saying, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. The object of this is not merely to avoid interference or annoyance, but to teach the mind to think down to the roots of the local customs. You learn the great lesson of Thelema that nothing is right or wrong in itself. As we say, circumstances alter cases. And I think the word context, we could reduce things to the word context, and that helps quite a bit. I feel like for a long stretch there was it seemed like people forgot what the word context meant. And anytime people start speaking in universals, like we're all supposed to think a certain way, we're all supposed to act a certain way, we're all supposed to this, that, or the other, they lose sight of the idea of context. But either way, it's important to Thelema, the idea of context and relativity. Incidentally, Einstein wrote his first paper on relativity. I think it was the paper on special relativity that was it was published in 1904, the same year as the reception of the Book of the Law. One more idea here when it comes to skepticism, the idea of doubt. In controversies, always disagree. See the other man's argument, but however much your judgment approves them, find the answer. Let this be done dispassionately. The more convinced you are that a certain point of view is right, the more determined you should be to find proofs that it is wrong. If you have done this thoroughly, these points of view will cease to trouble you. You can then assert your own point of view with the calm of a master, which is more convincing than the enthusiasm of a learner. So thank you for having taken the time to think of a philosophical rebuttal.
Yeah, I was going to say a way to condense that is steelman your opponent's argument. Build their argument as best you can, and then attack it with your.
I was just going to add, is the strongest polemicists are ones who study apologists that they're attacking in depth from their perspective.
Yeah. And I know that that's something that you practice even as you preach it. You know what I mean? It's like something that you go out and do better than anyone I've known. So, yeah. Much appreciated. So, yeah, and that's something I try to do is like, argue. Now, I don't think that means disrespect or disrespectfully. I think it's like whatever the case may be, you can argue it and look at the alternate point of view. Even if you don't, if you fundamentally agree with the other person, it's good to be able to look at, well, what about, this over here? Because it you can provoke discussion, you can provoke advancement and progress and change. It's not uncommon for people to complain about the fact that, everybody argues about things and you can't have a discussion about things. But we can practice having discussions about things and learn how to have discussions about things. Now, I'm going to move on to bringing things back to symbol in a certain sense, because I've been talking about these ideas here. We started with the idea that, well, you have an idea, and that will degenerate as it's passed along. There's like a feedback effect when it's bouncing around, and usually, just like the idea of people disagreeing, one side's going to pick up on an idea and see it from their point of view. And they can't agree with the other side because then that would be a submission, a concedence, if that's a word. Yeah, it would be somehow, gross and dirty. It would be sort of like what you were talking about, where it's like when you're worried about losing some part of yourself. That's one of the reasons that it feels like you have to stay on this side of the line, because if you admit, oh yeah, they have a point there, or, you know what, I actually do kind of feel that way. No, I'd rather make that other so I can stay distinct from it. But that causes the idea to be degenerated because it's only one-sided. And in Thelema, we're not one-sided. Ideally, we are talking about amalgamating until we include all things. And believe me, even Hitler and his tendencies, potencies, whatever, dwell within you. And if you deny it, you leave yourself open for a blind spot where that can come up and bite you in the ass. I mean, it's sickening. There was a time when I was looking into mob mentality and that sort of thing, and it's like amazing how people can do horrendous things in a mob, and even after the fact, say, no, I'm glad I did it and I don't regret it at all. Normal people, like I'm not talking about Nazis or anything like that, I'm talking about normal people who thought they could never do such a thing before the fact. So these potencies lie within us, all because we are human. But anyway, bringing it back to what I was trying to get towards is the powers of the Sphinx. This comes up, as does the idea of the 5 L's. So we have, well, the 4 L's constitute the 5th L. So the 5th L is the law. The law of Thelema. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Perhaps if we can distill the law into such a small, pithy statement, we can keep it from corruption. Well, we'll see how that works out. But the law, if we look at the 4 rays of the law, as Crowley talks about them in Liber Libellum, we have life, light, liberty, and love. Life for the bull in the Sphinx. And this is to will. To will something, the bull, that strength of the Taurus. And I attribute this to discipline in our analogy here. We've been talking about discipline. We've been talking about skepticism. We've been talking about genius. So to will, I would say, is discipline, because discipline is a prerequisite to being able to will more fully. For some reason, I'm going into Shatner. Apologies. To dare, light. The L attributed to light, which is the lion. I would attribute this to genius, the light. We are that hollow tube for the fire from heaven to come through us. To know is liberty. To know gives us our liberty, enables us, empowers us. This is an elastic form of government. This is skepticism in our analogy. Finally, to keep silence. Crowley in Liber Aleph attributes this to the dragon, which is Scorpio, and it ends up being the scorpion, the serpent, and the eagle. The scorpion he sees as the lowest of these forms, which kills itself to avoid suffering in the fire. So by its own fear, it destroys itself and is its own defeat. But the serpent and the eagle are the higher forms of the scorpion or Scorpio. And to keep silence is also attributed to love in our 4 L's. Now, he also attributes this to the vehicle itself, the machinery, the enginery. So I guess if the enginery is moving in silence without dis-ease, as he likes to break that word up, dis-ease, if it's moving in silence, smoothly, and in harmony, then it can enable all the other elements to come together for the operation of the will. And I'm going to attribute to this, since it's love, the idea of union as well. And this can be, in yoga, the idea of samadhi, and sexual orgasm is the analogy of this as well. As much as people like to think of Crowley as a dirty old man, he also emphasizes the fact that people who see sex as a dirty thing are themselves dirty. All things are filthy to the filthy. But all things are pure to the pure. So if you can see that sex and the orgasm is the physical analog of the divine, and what in the divine that it is an analog of, then you'll be closer to the mark. So if you treat it like a sacrament, it becomes a sacrament. And it's so much the easier to experience this idea of union, ecstatic union. Now, I've reduced these ideas to the form of symbols. And again, we know the dangers of things degenerating once they're in symbol form. So genius, skepticism, and discipline being our methods to put things into alignment to facilitate genius. And then we also have the idea of union in general. These can help us to reduce a lot of these complicated subjects into simplified form. So we can talk about them as light, life, love, and liberty, and create analogs for that. We have correspondences to simplify things. This all can be under the umbrella of the law. And we have the Book of the Law, which Crowley claims was delivered unto him by Aiwass. And because it is in its own pages, it requires that the writing of the beast itself, so the manuscript, the facsimiles of the manuscript are to be included with the Book of the Law. This helps to preserve the word. It helps to preserve the idea, a fundamental process here. Now, it still will suffer from change. Now, that is good in our eyes. Change is good. We can't grasp onto things. We can't try to cling to an unchanging stasis. That is folly. Crowley also did talk about the HGA, and if we personify, anthropomorphize the Holy Guardian Angel, we've got his sort of take on it, which I'll briefly read over. So the Holy Guardian Angel, he who became the Master Therion, meaning Crowley himself, was once confronted by this very difficulty, referring to something earlier in the paper. Being determined to instruct mankind, he sought a simple statement of his object. So he wanted to reduce it into a simple form. His will was sufficiently informed by common sense to decide him to teach man the next step, the thing which was immediately above him. He might have called this God, or the higher self, or the Algoides, or Adi Buddha, or 61 other things, but he had discovered that these were all one. Yet that each one represented some theory of the universe which would ultimately be shattered by criticism. For he had already passed through the realm of reason and knew that every statement contained an absurdity. He therefore said, "Let me declare this work under this title, The Obtaining of the Knowledge and the Conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel." Because the theory implied in these words is so patently absurd that only simpletons would waste much time in analyzing it. It would be accepted as a convention, and no one would incur the grave danger of building a philosophical system upon it. And yet, we consistently try and try and try. So remember that we each individually are the base, foolish secretary working under our own genius. And hopefully this helps to give some kind of perspective on the subject of the philosophy of Thelema, more importantly just Thelema in general and the practice of Thelema. And I'm hoping that when you're reading Crowley, you have this in mind. And you can see these things popping off the page so that you're not just going by your own preconceptions about what you're expecting it to be, which is so easy to do, especially when you're approaching such a vast body of work. It's quite prolific and self-referential, so it's nice to, get some kind of bearings when you're sailing the seas of Crowleyana. So thank you very much for coming out tonight. Love is the law, love under will. I'll multiply that clapping sound by many times, so it sounds like.
I like your secretary analogy. Actually, there's something you said that I can't believe. Yeah, the secretary is the last to know.
Yeah.
I was like, well, that's kind of interesting because in true will statements, when somebody comes to understand their true will and they talk about it with other people, everybody's like, duh.
Yeah.
Right? And yeah, the secretary is the last to know.
Yeah, it's so true.
So I love that analogy. It's really good.
Yeah, I thought about that too. Like, somebody has a particular disposition. Everybody around them recognizes
Everybody
that
knows,
disposition. Yeah.
except them.
Yeah.
The ultimate blind spot.
I'm a psychopath. Oh.
Yeah, we all knew.
It's funny too. It's like the deeper I get into understanding my true will, the more it's exactly the same as it ever was. You know, it's like
Womp womp. Anticlimactic HGA. Say no, a real spiritual experience.
The will itself is the same, but the thing that's the attainment.
and everything in your life and experience actually makes sense suddenly. It's like you didn't have to get out of that and find your way to something different. All of that makes sense in hindsight. It's like, oh, it's a pony, you know.
Thanks for listening. Look for Toronto Thelema on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Watch for events in the city. And join us again in the darkly splendid abodes.